Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you for joining us. Hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Bill Leake, the CEO of Apogee Results, to talk about how companies can move their marketing functions from a startup stage to a growth stage company. Bill, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Great. Can you give us more about your background and how you got to where you are today?
It's been a somewhat circuitous journey. I think most of us, when we look back at a couple decades of a career, say, that didn't go exactly as planned. Not bad, but not quite as planned. I would describe myself as a recovering McKinsey & Company consultant. I did that very early in my career. And ever since then, the challenge has been how to actually execute and execute well and help other people execute rather than just talking about the theory of execution, which is what you learn at McKinsey. So I've done a variety of things in my career, including being part of the first team to ever sell $1 million of product on the internet. We beat Amazon and Dell and eBay and a number of others to that milestone. Being president of a Software 500 fast-growing company, serving as head of global marketing for a VC-backed enterprise services company that's now public, and have at various times had consultancies and agencies in the marketing space that help other companies launch and then scale and grow. And then in the spare time, which I don't have, I do some occasional angel investing and a lot of mentoring and coaching through the likes of Mass Challenge and Founders, and occasionally serve on boards of things like Austin Technology Council and TextChange. So love the technology space, love the startup space, love innovation. Real passion is working with folks who have a vision to change some part of the world and help ensure they get the parts and pieces necessary to make it happen.
Well, we were talking the other day about marketing at startup companies and marketing at growth companies, and I thought you had some pretty good insights about the differences between the two, and maybe you can share those with us here.
Sure. Well, and some startup companies are doing no marketing. They're really just focused on the product still. A lot of other startup companies are doing some marketing, but it's really kind of throwing the spaghetti against the wall part of marketing, finding where is enough of it sticking that we can build a data case to get to the next level in scaling. So I would say startup companies in marketing you always want to have a culture of innovation and experimenting, but startup companies are really looking to test their hypotheses, figure out where is a critical mass of customers, what is the messaging and positioning that will allow us to establish a beachhead and maintain it. When companies move to the growth stage, hopefully they've already found that beachhead and now they're trying to really expand it. So they've already landed, it's fertile soil, but now they've got to till it and grow it, but also be looking for that next one. But a key part of scaling is the execution into a space that already has some preliminary compelling metrics.
So they have different goals between the two of them and so forth. Maybe you can describe a little bit more, go into more of that a little bit. As a startup, what are you exactly trying to get done before you can get to the next level?
Great question. So if I'm a startup and I'm not bootstrapped, let's say I'm artificial financed through angel and I'm looking to get that next institutional round, what I'm really trying to figure out, my goals are coming up with a data set of saying, look, I spent X, I've got this Y, and I've done some research to say, hey, there's headroom here to spend 10X or 100X, and this Y that I got, I think I can improve it by Z%. And when we put all that together, the economics of scaling are working, and therefore you should give me this $8 million investment because we have done enough of the sussing out this beachhead with these metrics that justify the investment. So ideally in a startup, you've kind of figured out by some experimentation what the growth marketing strategy is going to be. You'll get a much better valuation than going to investors and saying, hey, we've got this great product and give us a lot of money so we can figure out who's going to buy it and how much it's going to cost for them to buy it. That's a much less compelling pitch.
So you end up having a different tech stack as a startup than you do as a growth company. If somebody's just starting out their startup today, what kind of tech stack should they be putting into place?
One thing I'd definitely counsel is light and flexible. And this side, I'd say for both startups and growth companies, one of the risk factors is sometimes the executives coming in here have only worked with companies that were already in the 8 figures and beyond, or already at 50 to 100 employees and beyond. They're going to pull stuff from the tech stack that was great back in the day or great for the size of the company they were at, but is a complete process overload and bureaucratic killer for a startup or growth company. One example on that is, I'd say, is Salesforce.com. A decade ago is a great thing to put in if you've got a small company. Now, I wouldn't recommend that thing unless you already have over 100 sales reps, and maybe not even then. So it's kind of understanding the landscape of marketing and sales technology, understanding the age of the code, like what's legacy code, what's new code, and what's the right amount of process for where you are. And so with a startup company, one of the key things there is to avoid lock-in. You don't really know for sure what's going to work yet. And so you're trying to figure out, what can I do as cheaply as possible? Can I do Pipedrive? Can I do Zoho? I'm not ready to get into the big marketing automation app yet. And if I'm getting into something, if I decide to write checks for HubSpot, do I have an escape strategy? How easy is it to get out of it? And to not overspend a lot of money on configuration when I don't really know what my process is going to be, what my customer journey is going to be. So as a startup, I'm trying to figure out cheap, flexible, not going overly down the path of automating the wrong process because I don't yet know the right process. I have to figure that out. Once I get to growth mode, I know a little bit more and I can start to bake in and hardwire a few more things, kind of a few more pieces of pipe behind the drywall. But when I'm a startup, I don't want to put down the tile yet. I want all the PVC pipes still exposed.
So when you get to the growth stage company, what are the tools you're going to start looking at that point? Of course, you're going to start baking in things that'll be for the longer haul because you know what you actually need. But what does a tech stack actually look like for a growth company?
I'm going to need some sort of CRM system. I'm going to need some sort of support system. I'm going to need some sort of document management system. And I'm going to need some sort of email marketing system. We can call it marketing automation. Figuring out what's my web CMS. You're going to be likely baked on top of Google Analytics as well. And then if you're an e-com, it's what kind of shopping cart system are you putting in place and the other cluster of apps around that. But it's those kinds of things. Some of them are known things at that point, and you can start to slap up a little bit of drywall over the PVC once you've kind of figured out your go-to-market strategy.
What kind of money do you need to actually put those tools into place, either revenue or funding, to really kick off a good marketing platform?
You don't need a lot, but the danger here is you can spend an awfully large amount if you're not careful. A lot of the apps out there that have the Gartners and Forresters and everybody waving their hand and saying you must buy them. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a guy in Young President's organization who was running a successful 8-figure insurance company. And one of his other YPO buddies who ran a Marketo consultancy talked him into buying Marketo. And all of a sudden, the guy took $250,000 to get the thing implemented, $80K for the license, $250,000 to get it implemented. And I asked the guy, how big is your house list? And he said, it's 6,000 people. He should have still been on MailChimp for $100 a month. So there's a danger here in listening to the sales reps with their fancy decks and their fancy slides. It's very, very easy to overbuy if you're not careful and spend a disproportionate amount of your very expensive VC. On the other hand, there are a bunch of things out there that you can MacGyver this stuff together and not spend a fortune. You can get a long way on Hootsuite before you have to get to Spreadfast. And so it's kind of having someone on your team who can sit through these sales demos and has lived the life of a 7-figure company, an 8-figure company, and a 9-figure company, or at least can call in favors from folks who can let them know what's the right tool for the job. You don't want to buy the really expensive wood chipper when you just have one Christmas tree to chop into pieces. That's where a hand axe is just fine.
Right. Well, I had a friend that was an interim CEO that worked at growth companies, and he says whenever he shows up at a growth company, they used to be C, but now they're growth, they have at least one blown HubSpot implementation behind them, and he's in there trying to do the next version of it. And so money is one aspect, but then skills to use these tools tends to be the other aspect. What are the skills you need for a seed level group? What should somebody be looking for that marketing operation?
So at the seed level, you're kind of looking kind of, let's say you're going from 1 to 3 sigma. You want innovation, you want creativity, and you want data. So you kind of want a good work ethic, creativity, both sides of the SAT. So you've got data skills and you've got some communication and creative skills, but you're really not trying to flesh it out at the nth degree of excellence. I mean, it's kind of like, I guess, a hunting analogy would be this is where you're figuring out how to skin it and gut it, but it's not something you throw on a dinner plate yet. And so you kind of need that utility infielder, broad knowledge of what to test, how to test, and what tools to try. It's a hammer, not a nail gun. It might even be a rock and a piece of metal. When you start getting into the growth phase, you're starting to take some of the skills from the handyman level to the, well, I think I need a plumber for this. I think I need an electrician for this. Oh, this is something that I actually care about the cosmetics. So somebody needs to know how to do taping and floating. But at the initial stages, what you really kind of want is a really smart handyman who can do a little bit of architecture and can do a little bit of everything and is savvy enough to know when the master electrician is called for.
Well, to go back to my CEO analogy or his advice, he said most people just look at the dollar cost. They don't look at the time cost of putting these tools into place. With HubSpot and Marketo, they require a tremendous amount of content creation that people always underestimate. So it seems like there has to be a lot more content coming into some of these tools as well as specialized skills to make them work as well. What's your experience there?
We see that all the time, and we see that with enterprise outfits too. I mean, there are a bunch of tools out there that cost $3,000 a month, $5,000, $10,000, or $15,000, and a lot of times that's just the tool cost is kind of the ante at the poker table. But you got to show up and play poker, and you got to put additional chips on the table. So a lot of times, the real cost is the human, and not the tool. And so really it's almost more important to get the right, it actually is more important to get the right humans who can figure out the right process. And then once you know that, then you go looking for the tool that best fits that process with the least amount of configuration and implementation cost. Because we see a lot of cases where people fall in love with a tool, they put the wrong tool in place, and then they either have a hard time attracting people with that skill set because it's a rarefied or very expensive skill set, or they get someone with the right skills in, and that person says, well, that's not the tool I want. Well, it's like, well, we're signed up for that on a 2-year contract. We got a special.
So, down that path, signing up for things, what kind of services should a seed company really be looking to bring in from outside, if anything? And then what should the growth company be looking for to augment their team?
Great question. Well, when I look at marketing services, I rarely think the answer is 100% in-house. I rarely think the answer is 100% outsourced. Sometimes it is phenomenally valuable to have that expert come in who can just do that piece of brain surgery, no matter what it costs, versus the utility infielder who's going to grind it out, may miss the tumor, and it's going to take them 2 weeks, whether they get it right or wrong. They're kind of figuring it out. So it's usually a blend. So there are some skill sets that I do think typically should be done in-house in the marketing function. I typically think that the earned part of social media should have a large in-house component. I typically think that email marketing is often best done in-house, not always, but often. I think it's important that somebody in-house knows how to read Google Analytics and pull reports, that somebody in-house knows how to pull reports from the marketing automation system, knows how to get things into Salesforce.com, can interpret the data. You don't want to leave all of the data interpretation in an outsourced service. There are some very specialized skill sets out there, like managing Google ads or managing Facebook ads or doing SEO properly with the 10 different subsets, that I think a large part of it often is best outsourced. Because if you're in a competitive space, and maybe you're not as a startup, but if you're competing against other outfits that are established or have raised equity, whether more or less than you, you're probably in a competitive space. And you're just not going to get there with the utility infielder showing up with the Texas State football team. You may actually need the Alabama team, which typically means you need to outsource to acquire that skill set or the 10 different sub-skills in there. PR, I'm on the fence with. I'm a huge believer in the power of PR. I've worked with organizations where it's been outsourced. I've run a global marketing organization where I was in charge of an in-house PR and analyst relations team, and I think we did it better. But that's an investment. So you can go either way on that. But the important thing is when you're outsourcing something, it doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to it. You can't just say, "Oh, that's 100% being handled here." You need to at least understand enough of how it works that you can pitch in and lean into it when necessary and help with that. Like if you have a PR firm and they're pitching for awards or they're pitching for speaking gigs, sometimes it's best to have them pitch as if they were you. Because generally, people prefer dealing with principals rather than intermediaries. So kind of thinking through that whole thing, how that all shakes out in the equation. But generally a blend of services, but it's figuring out of your internal resources. What it really comes down to is what's the highest and best use of their time. You're using a Ricardian theory of comparative advantage here. Even if you can do it better than an outsourced person, if there's another task that's even more important for you to be doing, you should be doing the most important task. And the stuff that doesn't fit your skill set and impact, that you can't do it in a skill set and it's not an A impact, you should outsource.
Well, the other question I get from seed companies is that there's about 20 different marketing channels out there. There's PR, email, SEO, etc. And they're always asking, which of those do I go after? Because as seed, you really can't go after all of them. And then, of course, when you get to growth company, they start to change as well. What's your guidance on a seed company's choice of marketing channels that they should focus on?
That's a great question because I often have people coming to me and saying, "Hey, I want to buy X, and I see that your company sells X. Can I buy X from you?" And I'll look at what they're doing. I'm saying, "Well, you don't need X yet. You need A, B, and C first. And I don't want to sell you X because it's not the best thing for you to start with." So one of the ways to determine that is to look at the maturity of your market and figure out how innovative is your product. Is it a better version of something that people are already used to buying? So if people are already searching for something like what you have and you just have a better one, then the various elements of search, Google Ads and Bing and SEO, are phenomenally powerful because people are already looking for the thing. On the other hand, if you've got something that's different enough and wonky enough and potentially world-changing, but people need to be educated about it, well, then that's for definitionally people aren't searching yet. So you kind of have to train them through social media, through PR, through word of mouth and viral to even be on the lookout for this thing. So some of it is where does your offering fit within the pantheon of what's already out there? Are you a better version of what exists, or are you something orthogonal and different and new? Another thing to look at is what assets do you start with? Do you already have a big Rolodex? Like we've got a guy here in town, a phenomenal fellow who founded Bizarre Voice, a guy named Brett Hurt. Before that, he'd founded an analytics company before Google Analytics. They were the monster, the 800-pound beast of the industry called Coremetrics. And in the process of that, he had built up a phenomenal relationship base with some of the world's top retailers. So the best go-to-market strategy for them on startup and launch was to lean into that and lean into those already established relationships. So look at all your assets. Figure out, do you have a big email list? Is it a house list? Do they know and like and trust you? Do you already have some customers? Can you get them to give testimonials? What are you surfing near a really trendy topic where you've got something that's different enough and yet interesting enough that you're going to be able to get a lot of PR in the AI space or the Internet of Things space or what have you space. So the answer is going to not be monolithic from one startup to another, which is where, when I say you need a really, really smart utility infielder, I mean, a lot of folks default in the startup phase and say, we'll just get a growth hacker. And what that meant was, typically it's some person who went through a little bit of coding camp and kind of failed out, but now they can communicate with engineers and they can pretend they know how to do everything. That's generally what you really almost want is a fractional CMO who's done it before and is whip smart. And they're going to figure out the plan of, as we're going down the test plan of marketing channels, what's our hypothesis A, our hypothesis B, our hypothesis C, and how do we test each of these as rapidly and cheaply as possible until we get a winner? And when we get a winner, how do we figure out how much can I step on the gas? How much headroom do I have with this winner?
So for those who are going from a seed stage to a growth stage company, they're starting to figure things out, funding's starting to come in. How do you make that transition? Is it a grand breadbasket turnover one day, or is it a slow trying things out and moving things over piecemeal? How do you transition from one to the other?
Some of it depends on who's on the team and who the capital sources are. Sometimes it's a very abrupt transition and you turn everything else off and you go all in on the thing that's working and create a defensible barrier. Sometimes you keep the other things on and just step on, kind of accelerate on the thing that's working while keeping the cloud of other things going. That's going to depend on resources. It's going to depend on skill sets. One of the key questions is looking at who do you have on the team? Now that we've identified the marketing channels that are required for scaling, how do we go get master electricians or master plumbers in that space? Do we bring them in-house? Do we partner with somebody? But how do we actually make sure that we're upskilling in those areas that we've determined we need to move from handyman to someone who specializes in it? And do we have the resources or the desire to do the other things? I still recommend, when budget is there, to always have a culture of testing new things and learning, because eventually in any marketing channel, you're going to start to hit diminishing returns. And you want to be ready to fire up the next kind of fuel, the next kind of fuel, the next kind of fuel. And ideally, you'll be in a place where you've got 2 or 3 things that are working at the same time. So you're not entirely dependent on YouTube working for you until Google changes an algo thing, or Facebook working for you until Mark Zuckerberg takes away, like he did just recently, the ability to filter folks by income.
Well, that always changes the game when you're on platforms like Facebook and Google and they start to make changes to the algorithm or the plan and so forth. So how do you handle that situation when you're on a platform and then suddenly they change the tools on you? Do you just move to another platform, or is there anything you can do about that?
Well, sadly, sometimes you just lose.
It sounds like there's not much you can do about that, and maybe a question mark about building your entire strategy on it. But you see a lot of seed and growth companies out there. If you had to pick one thing you see the most common mistake seed companies make, and then the most common one that growth companies make, what would you say that is in choosing these tools and implementing them into their marketing program?
I'd say with seed companies, a lot of them is they'll get an early marketing person who is limited in imagination to what's worked for them before. And so they got a hammer and everything in the world is a nail that just needs a hammer. And this happens in all functions, and not just in marketing and sales, but they're not getting a utility infielder. They're hiring a roofer or a tiler or a tape and floater, and for them, everything's a tape and float problem. Or worse, they get this growth hacker who's a good talker, but it really doesn't know when they have something that works and when they need to go to the next level. So I see that with the startups. With the growth companies, I see a lot of overbuying the wrong thing. They go too deep into a technology, get too wedded to something, and then it becomes a straitjacket, and it's very, very hard to be flexible. Or they're doubling down on the wrong platform and not investing any money in terms of experimenting around the edges, so they at least have a reserve tank of gas for platform number 2 if something really changes on platform number 1.
So what are the marketing budgets for these different levels? At the seed, what should a CEO be budgeting? And then at growth, what number does that jump up to be if you had to put some ballparks on it?
That's a great question. That's all over the map. I mean, there are some industry numbers there, like people should spend 8% of their revenue on marketing or 15%, or sometimes that changes from vertical to vertical. We see cases where people are spending 200% of revenues on marketing. We see cases where people are spending 5 or 6. So some of it depends on the capital you have. Some of it depends on how fast you need to get data. And some of it depends on your expected margin characteristics and the patience of your investors. Like in the e-com space, if you're really well capitalized and you're early stage, Amazon didn't start to make money until a few years ago. So some of it is, I mean, if you think people are going to come back and buy 10 times and that they're going to tell other people about it because they've had a good experience, maybe for your first 10,000 customers, from a marketing perspective, you're willing to eat the entire cost of the first 8 times those first 10,000 customers come and buy, because you're planting a seed that's going to bear massive fruit down the road. Now, if you're bootstrapping your company and you're starved for capital, you might not be able to spend any more for marketing than you can to achieve as much margin as you can on sale number 1. So I know that's not being helpful, but I mean, typically the marketing budget can easily be less so in the startup phase, but in the growth phase, it could be easily 40% of the raise.
And so that brings up a good point. Most of these companies are dependent upon the raise to get to the next level. What happens when the fundraise comes up short? Who takes the haircut, and how do you prioritize?
That's a great question. I just want to make one step back to the previous question. The other thing that determines the marketing budget is who's your customer. So if you're selling direct to consumer or to small and micro businesses, you're typically dealing with a far larger marketing budget as a percent of sales. If you're selling through channels or you're selling to enterprise, you're typically dealing with a smaller marketing budget, and you have a larger percentage of your total budget eaten up by the sales function. So the closer you are to consumers and the closer you are to small businesses, typically the marketing budget is larger than the sales budget. When you get to enterprise and you get to channels, oftentimes that flips. To your next question, who takes the haircut? It really becomes a prioritizing. You're cutting into muscle, but what you don't want to do is to cut into vital organs. So it's kind of figuring out, how do you keep the embers glowing? How do you keep enough of the flywheel moving to try to restore yourself to a break-even position or create a new data set for another attempt at the raise? So that unfortunately does tend to cut off the experimentation piece of the budget because you're preserving the core.
I gotcha. That makes sense. Well, you see quite a few of these out there. In the last few minutes that we have in the interview, what else should we cover that we haven't so far?
Well, we could talk about the changing nature of search and social platforms. We could talk about a lot of the new MarTech things that are coming out there. We could talk about some novel strategies for hiring marketing folks that a lot of folks don't do. Actually, I kind of like that one. One of the fun things that I've had our firm do a couple times is actually work with a startup when they've decided they need to take a function in-house, for us to actually be part of the interview team and evaluate folks as if we were evaluating them to be part of our team. For instance, we probably do hundreds of SEO and Google ads and Facebook ads management interviews every year, and hundreds of them, and boil them down to only a very small number of people that we're willing to accept. If you don't already have that skill set in-house, how are you going to figure out whether that person you're hiring actually knows how to do it? You're probably not. So a lot of people get really flawed marketing hires because they don't know how to interview a marketing person and they don't know how to strip the BS. I mean, a lot of marketing people are great at BS, almost as good as salespeople. And
it's a tie.
Kind of a close tie. And like, how do you strip the BS off if that's not your shtick, if that's not your core competence? And I would say find a friend that you trust, maybe from Vistage, maybe from YPO or EO, or some of the people that other firms in your VC's portfolio or are working with, and say, hey, could I pay you hourly to be part of my interview team? And I want you to really test the candidates that I'm liking for their actual chops, and come back and tell me, would you hire these people? Do they actually have the skills they pretend to? And what grade would you give them on their skill set? And almost nobody does that. But the folks we've worked with that do that, it's amazing. They actually end up getting an A player in-house, where more likely than not, they would have had a C player otherwise.
Well, how often do you go by recommendations or previous job experience, or is that just too easy to fake and it doesn't necessarily apply to the job you're trying to hire for? How do you weigh those two against each other?
You definitely look for recommendations. I mean, in some cases, the problem there is that the actual company won't say anything, or they'll say, yeah, they were here before X and Y, or they're happy to lie and see the person go because they don't want to pay unemployment. So I'm a fan, when it comes to references, I'm a fan of using LinkedIn, finding who else that they didn't give as a reference do you know that you have a trust relationship with that may know the other person. and try to get the real story. So I'm a fan of checking references, but I'm a fan of checking references that weren't given.
That makes sense. Well, cool. Well, appreciate your coming on and sharing that with us today. Hope to have you back for a follow-up. But in the meantime, how best for the audience to get back in touch with you?
Well, you can find me easily via email, my last name, Leake, at Apogee Results, APOGEE, Results, RESULTS.com. I don't tweet much, so there's really no point finding me on Twitter. You search for my name, William Leake, Leake. You'll find me on LinkedIn. Send me an invite there. Always happy to sit down and have a coffee and look at a pitch deck and tell you what I think. Although I can be kind of a crusty bastard, so you may not want to hear the answer. and I'm pretty easy to find on Facebook as well.
Well, that's great. We'll put that in the show notes and let people get back in touch with you afterwards, and appreciate your taking time to join us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.